All right, so I thought I'd do this video on cell respiration. I'm Dr. Roos. I teach biology and microbiology. I'm doing this for both of my classes. So the idea of cell respiration is, right, the cells in our body are breathing, right, but oxygen's required for it, for instance. It's aerobic cell respiration, which we're talking about. And that's usually what you assume when you say cell respiration. We need to make, our cells in our body need to make ATP, right? It's like a little battery. It doesn't actually produce the entire ATP molecule, but you convert ADP that has two phosphates, adenosine diphosphate, into adenosine triphosphate with three, right? So you charge the battery up, the ATP molecule, right, when you add a phosphate to it like that. So we start with glucose, right, because we are going to literally burn glucose into carbon dioxide and oxidize it. That's going to release electrons, right? Each one of these carbons, we're going to take 2 electrons from that molecule and turn these 6 carbons in glucose are linked together, right? Carbon dioxide contains 1 carbon, and we can generate 6 of those from 1 glucose molecule, right? So when we exhale carbon dioxide, where did the carbon dioxide came from? Right? It came from the glucose molecule, as in our mitochondria, and the cells are respiring, right? So there's 3 main parts to cell respiration, right? You've got glycolysis first. That's a biochemical pathway. We convert glucose to pyruvate. We literally lyse the glucose, right? We separate and generate 2 3-carbon pyruvates. I focus on the carbons because that's really what you want to follow, right? Glucose has oxygens and hydrogens in it, right? But they're not as critical to keep track of, right? So during glycolysis, then there's actually an intermediate step. So, right, that's the first part. The second part is called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, depending on the textbook. Right, that's either one. It's a biochemical pathway, right? And when we're going through these processes of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, right, we're literally oxidizing glucose, right? It's being converted to several things in the process, right? Which I don't want to focus on all that, right? Because I want to give you more of the bigger picture. But glucose is being oxidized by, we're removing electrons. So when we take electrons in going from, say, glucose to pyruvate, there's 10 steps, we have NADH is generated, okay? You go from NAD to NADH. The difference between the two is a hydrogen, and it gains electrons, right? When it goes from NAD, you start with NAD without the H, and then you feed electrons to it to get NADH. The electrons are the important thing. That's why glucose has calories or energy, right? We're trying to remove those electrons, and we're going to remove more in the Krebs cycle, generate more NADH, FADH2, and those electrons are going to feed the electron transport chain. That's what ETC stands for. The electron transport chain is in the mitochondrial inner membrane, where you have cytochromes. So it's like a little copper wire, right? If you feed electrons through the wire, through the cytochromes, that generates a charge on the mitochondrial inner membrane. And that charge is like no different than if you were to charge up your battery, right? Lithium ion battery, you charge it, you're basically moving lithium ions when you charge it, and then when you let it go, right, you unplug your phone, you're using the charge, the battery that's charged up, the lithium ions are moving. So what happens with the cytochromes is you move hydrogen ions. So they get moved from one side of the membrane to another. It gets charged up. Then you release the charge, and you can convert ADP, right, which ADP has 2 phosphates, and it becomes ATP with 3 phosphates. It's oxidative phosphorylation, it's referred to when you make, right, ATP, it's electron transport chain. Right, so those are the 3 parts, right? You have glycolysis, you have a Krebs cycle, electron transport chain are all, right, used in cell respiration in the mitochondria to make ATP. Okay, so the thing that's one of the key things to remember about this is you say the carbons of glucose become, right, there's 6 of them, become 6 carbon dioxides. Each carbon dioxide has 1 carbon, right, so there's 6. There's an intermediate step between glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. I call it intermediate. There's not really a formal name for it. And in that process, you go from pyruvate to acetyl group, which is these 2 carbons, right? So these 3 carbons, pyruvate becomes acetyl or acetyl-CoA. I tend to leave that out. But when you go from 3 to 2 carbons, this carbon becomes CO2. The 2 remaining carbons get fed into the Krebs cycle, and that's where they get converted to carbon dioxide. Same thing happens with this, right? You get 2 pyruvates from 1 glucose. The other 3 carbons go through the same process, right? And you've oxidized these 6 carbons of glucose into 6 CO2s. Okay, so you say glucose is oxidized during aerobic cell respiration, becoming CO2, each one of these carbons. The electrons that came from glucose are fed by NADH and FADH2. Now they're generated in the citric acid cycle, they're generated in intermediate step, they're also generated in glycolysis. I can't remember the total number, but right, those NADHs and FADH2s are used to carry the electrons. They shuttle the electrons to the electron transport chain. They contain energy. Okay, that energy is used to make ATP. Now the electrons are eventually fed to what we call the final electron acceptor, oxygen. Right? So oxygen is required. We breathe in oxygen. The purpose of breathing in oxygen is so that we feed electrons to it in our mitochondria at the electron transport chain. It's converted to water. Oxygen is reduced at that point. So you have to feed the electrons, right, to the cytochromes, right? And because the electrons are moving through the cytochromes, it charges the membrane in the mitochondria, intermitochondrial membrane. That charge energy is used, right? I think it's ATP synthase is the enzyme. Synthetase, right? It synthesizes ATP. It converts ADP into ATP. As long as we're feeding electrons through the cytochromes at the electron transport chain. Okay. The cytochromes feed the electrons to oxygen. It's reduced. Oxygen becomes water. Okay. So, I use the number 36 ATPs are generated in aerobic cell respiration most of the time. There are instances, depending on what cell you're in your body, it may only be 34 or 32, so it just depends. I like to just use the number 36 to make it a little bit easier. Okay, but this is the big picture for aerobic cell respiration. Aerobic means oxygen, right, is involved, right? And it's involved at the very end, more or less, when we have to feed the electrons that we are getting from glucose in this process, right? They have to go somewhere. So we call that the final electron acceptor. So there are other types of final electron acceptors depending on if, let's say, instead of aerobic, we were talking about anaerobic without oxygen, then we couldn't use oxygen as a final electron acceptor. Okay, but that's another story. I want to focus mainly on the aerobic cell respiration in this video. Right, so the big picture, these are the three main parts for aerobic cell respiration. The purpose of it is to make ATP. To make ATP, we oxidize the carbon in glucose, right? Glucose is required. Glycolysis converts glucose to pyruvate. The intermediate step converts pyruvate to acetyl. Right, you go from 6 carbons to 3 carbons to 2 carbons. You lose 2 carbons to CO2. These 2 carbons, it's 4 altogether, go to the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and they become CO2. Right, there's 8 enzymes that are used, right, in the citric acid cycle. Right, there's like 10 enzymes in glycolysis to convert glucose to pyruvate, and I'm leaving out all those steps on purpose because it's real complicated. Okay, and I want you to see the bigger picture here, and you know, I hope this video helped. And anyway, thanks for watching.